Hey everybody, so I was hoping to do a live today, and that was my full intention, but I am quarantined in my childhood bedroom with COVID, so I just think a live probably wouldn't work as well because, number one, you're not going to want to hear this nasally voice for, any more time than is necessary. And if I get winded and I start coughing and coughing, this is just not going to be a pleasant event for me and especially for you. So I'm going to do just a regular video on chapter 1 and the introduction today, and then we can pick up with a live next week when my voice isn't obnoxious. So not sure if you've gotten the chance to get your book yet, Forgiving What You Can't Forget. This is the first Lysa TerKeurst book I've ever read. I've followed her on social media for a while, and I like her content, but this is the first time I've actually read one of her books. And she starts out so strong in the introduction. At the very bottom of the first page of the introduction, she says, like your own personal BC and AD, which usually mean before Christ and Anno Domini. This dating was intended to indicate a turning point in history, the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Christ. When we have personal, marked moments in our own history, it can feel like before crisis and after devastation. I think for me, I have points in my life where they were so significant that they pivoted my perspective of people. They pivoted how I chose to trust. These times pivoted my definition of hope and of God and if He was good. And I don't know what you've went through, what your big moments are, but just to be totally vulnerable with you, I think for me there are 3 moments in my life that and they're not good moments. And I'm sure you probably feel the same, before crisis, after devastation. For me, the first one was probably when I was a preteen. My dad served in the military for 24 years, and he had PTSD and also TBI, traumatic brain injury. And I think at such a young age, watching my dad struggle with essentially an internal demon, I guess watching him go from this big jokester and this tall, 6'2", broad, handsome dude to a guy who was crippled by memories and a mental diagnosis that he couldn't fix overnight, that pivoted my perspective as a child on life and I guess just how scary life can be. I just that you can step outside your door and face things that aren't visible. There's really hard things in our lives, and I think the hardest ones are actually invisible things. I think they are from the enemy to get us to taint our perception of hope and God's goodness. So that was the first one for me. I think the second one, how old was I? 20. I was 20. I had been dating a Marine. I guess, you try to, end up dating somebody who reminds you of your dad when you think your dad is just stellar. And I found out he was really good at dating me and then ghosting and just saying it wouldn't work and then coming back into my life and out of my life. And when I was 20, I finally figured out it's because, when I wasn't necessarily giving him everything he wanted physically, he would go and get it from somewhere else, and then when he needed the good girl look to make mama happy, he'd come home and date me again. And I put up with that for about 2.5 years, and I think that tainted my ability to trust. I no longer took people at their word, and that filtered into my marriage. And thankfully, Josh, my husband, is so gracious and patient and trustworthy and understands what I went through. But I ditched the concept of fully trusting somebody, and unknowingly I displaced some of that on God and started not trusting him because I felt like it was me against the world. And then I think one of the last big pivotal points for me in life where I can see a distinct before it and after it is when I got diagnosed with intrusive thought obsessive compulsive disorder in 2019. And I was valedictorian of my high school class. I was the sorority girl who, you actually see my little sorority composite back here. I was known as the Virgin, and I was making all the A's in all my English courses. I was doing life just right. I was so used to perfection because so long as I was perfect, I didn't have to trust anybody because I could do everything. And to finally have a breaking point and end up in a therapist's office and, being told, yeah, you have intrusive thought OCD and it's not going to go away. There's medicine to help, and praise God for that modern miracle, but you're stuck with a mental disorder. And that shattered my ability to be perfect. And I think the beauty from that is, number one, it made me and my dad so much closer. It's essentially trauma bonding. My dad and I get each other in a way that most people don't. I mean, unless you know what it means to go to therapy and do brain work and unearth things that are mental things that you can't see. And it also taught me a huge lesson about God. It taught me grace and perfection can't coexist. You can't have that both ways. You either try to be perfect, which gives you no room to extend yourself grace, and usually you end up giving no one else grace either. It's a twofold, double-edged sword. Or you finally learn that perfection's not going to work, and you choose to chase after grace, and that's kind of where I'm at in life, trying to find delight in grace and trying to more easily admit when I mess up. Humbling, not fun, but it's really good soul work. And so I think Lysa TerKeurst starts out super strong here. She's like, what are your moments? What are those things that there's a distinct before you and after you of that event or those events? And I think what I like about this introduction and this first chapter is it's just honesty, and you can feel her grieving while she's writing this book. This talks about, in her life, it's about her husband's adultery, and so it's very raw and it's very real. And she actually says, I cried again today. It wasn't because something is wrong in my marriage. Restoration is a gift for which I'm so very thankful. But that's not what this book is about. It's about figuring out what to do when you can't forget what happened, and forgiveness feels like a dirty word. I'll raise my hand here. That's why I cried today. If you relate to this, then you know how awful it is to define one's life with the words before and after. And so I think what I like is she does believe that there's beauty from ash, right? But she's not afraid to sit with the ash. She understands that you don't just snap your fingers and, oh, here's beauty from the worst thing that ever happened to you. there's just this, I get this feeling reading the introduction in the first chapter that you get to sit with your pain and you get to acknowledge it and you get to say, I was hurt. However, if you want to truly find freedom from what hurt you and let it start defining you in a healthy way, in a strong way, in a healing way, you gotta forgive it. She says at the very end of the introduction, I'm not sure if everyone has the same copy of the book. I would imagine it's all the same version, but some of her quotes have their own page, and it's usually because they're killer quotes. But she says at the end of the introduction, the more our pain consumes us, the more it will control us. And so I think what she's saying is, if we can't wrestle with the concept of forgiving the event, not forgetting it, but forgiving it, bitterness is going to seep in very easily. And while we think we're controlling the situation so that event never happens to us again, our bitterness and our pain end up controlling us, and then we're not free from what happened to us ever. And so she tees it up very strong. To me, it's a super compelling introduction. And so with chapter 1, forgiveness, remember I mentioned the double-edged sword earlier. That's actually what the first chapter is. Forgiveness, the double-edged sword. You know, she opens this chapter with the middle of her devastation, just the early days of finding out her husband was being unfaithful. And she lists some of those kind of scary tactics of the enemy that will root in you if you don't address the pain. You know, she said, cynicism dressed like a security guard, making me believe that if I hoped for less, it would protect me. Bitterness masqueraded like a high court judge, making me believe I must protect the evidence against all those who hurt me. Resentment cloaked itself in a banner marked with the word vindication. Delay snuck in like a theater attendant, offering popcorn in a comfy chair made of my sorrow and sadness, making me believe it was just fine to stay here, playing old movies of what had happened over and over. And lastly, trust issues disguised themselves as private investigators on stealth missions, making me believe they would help me catch everyone who was out to hurt me and prove no one was truly honest. I don't know about you, but when I look at page 3, I've been cynical, I've been bitter, I've resented, I have delayed the healing process, and I most definitely have had trust issues because of things that have been done to me. And so she tees it up so vulnerably. And I think where she really starts driving home the reality that you do have to choose what you do with the hurt. Like, the ball is in your court. It's at the bottom of 7. She says, but when I wrongly think forgiveness rises and falls on all my efforts, mustered up grit, conjured maturity, bossed around resistance, and gentle feelings that seem real one moment and fake the next, I'll never be able to authentically give the kind of forgiveness Jesus has given me. My ability to forgive others rises and falls instead on this, leaning into what Jesus has already done, which allows His grace for me to flow freely through me. Forgiveness isn't an act of my determination. Forgiveness is only made possible by my cooperation. God knew we couldn't do it on our own. He knew that full well. Right from the very moment the crunch of the forbidden fruit became sin's first sounds. And then came the hiss of the enemy's accusations and the pounding footsteps of a terrified man and woman. As soon as sin was their choice, The cover of darkness became their preference. I think sometimes when we think of darkness, we think of the enemy and sin and bad things. And we're like, no, we're not for the bad things. But I do think we retreat to dark places when we don't know what to do, whether it's in the face of our mess ups or in the face of someone hurting us. We retreat to dark places because they're quiet. And light purifies, light exposes, and we don't want to deal with that, because sometimes even when you're the person who's been wronged, you can see ways that you weren't the healthiest person either. I know I'm talking from experience, and sometimes you don't want to deal with your stuff. It's easier to blame somebody else. And I think that's what hit home for me so much in chapter 1. And she rounds it off with this beautiful quote at the very end, and it says, "Those who cooperate most fully with forgiveness are those who dance most freely in the beauty of redemption." I think the neat thing about our God is, he controls all the atoms that we can't see that make this world happen. We're living on a ball suspended in space that is tilted just right toward the sun, so we get just enough light to let plants grow and just enough light to warm our skin. We worship a God who is that in control of everything, yet he adores us so much that he lets us pick control. He doesn't force us to surrender to him. He doesn't force us to surrender a situation that's hurt us. He doesn't force us to forgive. But he loves us enough to say, hey, I promise if you will be willing, if you will cooperate, like Lysa mentions, you'll cooperate, you will live to see the beauty from the ash. And I think that's what this book's teeing up. I think this is going to be a beautiful display of how God brings meaning to bloodshed and brokenness. So I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section of what you thought of the intro of chapter 1. Like I said, next week, things will be much more normal when I am out of, the COVID quarantine. But you guys have an awesome weekend. Stay healthy, stay blessed, and I can't wait to chat with you in person.